a couple things that I want to say about this. First of all, the sort of standing theory about identity theft these days is that it's not a matter of if it will happen, but when. And so that's part of the reason why we take privacy and confidentiality so seriously at the site. But it's also because the taxpayer has a right to only have their information shared between them and the IRS. Now, if somebody was paying an accountant, obviously they have an intermediary, and so we're no different. But the expectation is that we are using their information only for the purposes of preparing their tax return. And so we have to be really careful about what we do with that information, both in the way that we interact with them, in the way that we talk about the work that we've done at the end of the day or with our friends and family. Protecting taxpayer privacy and confidentiality is one of the most important things that we do. And so we really do our best to minimize any issues where there would be a lack of privacy. And it's not always easy. I mean, here we'll be preparing returns across the hall in a computer lab. And so we've got multiple people in a room. You might have people who are sitting behind you that could potentially see your screen. Now, hopefully it's not big enough that, someone 2 rows behind can see you. In our other spaces, we're in a big open conference room with 4 or 5 preparers and 5 taxpayers, and the sound echoes. One of the things that we do at all of our sites is try to have background music going so that there's always some sort of ambient noise so that every comment isn't crystal clear. You can have a role in this in keeping your conversation volume as low as possible. Now, if we have older or hard of hearing taxpayers, that gets a little more difficult, but we do what we can. You can position your screen so that other people can't see it quite as easily. So there are things that you can do to maintain their privacy. So I covered a couple of those right away. Keeping your conversation volumes low, minimizing people's ability to see your computer screen. Ask only for information that's necessary and relevant. Now, this isn't to say that you can't make small talk with the taxpayer as you're working through things, but if there's information, so here's a great example. If somebody comes in, they're not married, they have a couple of kids, you've figured out, what you need to in terms of, yes, that person is eligible to claim those children as dependents. We don't have to worry about the partner, the other parent. This is not the time for you to ask about that romantic situation. Once you've got the tax law aspects figured out, you don't need to get into, why did that person leave? And, we're keeping it relevant to what needs to be included in the tax return. Very, very important. Always, always, always log off of TaxSlayer when you're done volunteering for the day. For those of you in Watoma and Wapaka, you have laptops that you'll be using, and so it would be pretty easy to just close that screen and consider it done. Well, the next person who opens that up, even though we hope that the system has automatically kicked you out, maybe not. We can't always guarantee that our technology works the way we expect it to. Shocking, I know. But, you just want to always make sure you go through the step of logging out. And particularly here in the computer lab at Midstate, you want to do that as well. So you'll log out of TaxSlayer, but you're also going to log out of the account that got you access to the internet. Never leave taxpayer materials unattended. You might have to run and get something from the printer. You might need to talk to your site coordinator. If the taxpayer is sitting there, that's not unattended. They've got their materials. But if they've gone to the bathroom or they need to go make a phone call and then you walk away, you need to make sure that those materials are protected. And so you can tuck them in a folder, give them back to the intake person. You can ask your site coordinator to sit down at your station until you get back. But we never want to leave things unattended because it's just too easy for materials to drop on the floor. So even if there's, again, no malicious intent, if something falls, and pieces of paper don't tend to just fall in a straight line. So maybe it slides over to another station and then another person puts it in their materials when they go. And now all of a sudden we've had a breach of confidentiality. We don't know that anything bad will happen because of that. Hopefully, that person returns it. Maybe they just throw it away. But we can't know what would happen, and we don't want to be in that position. Don't share information with anyone who doesn't have a need to know. And so this is, I think, one of the most difficult experiences that we have at the tax site, because we have some doozies that come and see us, and it's hard at the end of the day not to just want to go, I couldn't believe with this and that piece of paper, and then they told me this. Well, you might just think that you're blowing off steam, but especially when you're in a room with only 3 or 4 other preparers, it can be pretty easy for people to figure out exactly who you're talking about. And so it's not only a matter of maintaining confidentiality, it's a matter of respect. And so you might have a question about how to prepare something. You can ask another preparer, you can ask your site coordinator. And again, I mean, if you're in the middle of your appointment, it's going to be pretty obvious when you go to someone else and say, I have the taxpayer and I'm not sure what to do with this information. Okay, yes, they're going to know that you're talking about the person you are currently working with. But again, when you can avoid using names and other revealing details, do that. Because even if it's obvious to the person that you're asking that I need help with Connie's return, but I haven't said Connie's name, it just shows that I respect her privacy. And so, yep, if I'm asking Barb for help, it's going to be pretty clear that I need it for Connie, but we don't have to be really overt about that. Do not work on any VITA returns when you're not at the site. The software that we're using is on the internet, and so you will be able to log in and do other work from home. You'll be able to prepare your own returns from there, friends and family returns, but you should not be opening any VITA returns when you are not at the site. And this is an area where you're on your honor, but by signing that volunteer standards of conduct agreement, we assume that you understand that expectation and that you will honor that. Never, never, never share your TaxSlayer password with anyone, because you will be able to access the material from wherever you have an internet connection. If you tell somebody else, then they can do it too. And we don't want anybody else logging into our system. We're going to spend some time next week talking about how friends and family returns will work, because you do have that benefit by volunteering with us to do those returns for free. But again, that doesn't mean that you give your friends and family access to log in as you and they can prepare it themselves. It's something that you are taking the responsibility to do. So don't be sharing those passwords. I've got a couple handouts here. We'll start with that one. So this just gets into a little bit more detail about the IRS expectations for privacy and confidentiality. It's much more, I would say, legalese, and so it's not the friendliest language for understanding it, but I tried to make it a little bit more user-friendly, and I just want you to understand the scope of what it is that we're working with in trying to maintain those IRS expectations. The top half of that form is what we've just kind of covered in terms of basic expectations around privacy and confidentiality. But then we get to this idea of taxpayers giving us consent. So I said, we only need to collect information that is necessary and relevant to the return. We don't discuss anything outside the scope of that, and we keep that information protected. Asterisk. So we do want to be able to talk about what our program accomplishes. And in order to do that in the most compelling way, we do need to ask taxpayers if they're willing to give up a little bit of their privacy. So there are certain things that we don't need their authorization to share. just as a VITA program, we can tell people, last year we served 643 households across our 3 counties. 240 of those people were able to claim the earned income credit, and 181 taxpayers claimed Wisconsin's homestead credit. Well, that's nice. I mean, you can kind of figure out, oh, that's about a third, and like people can make those mental calculations, but I think those numbers by themselves aren't that exciting. It requires people to understand how taxes work, and frankly, 643 households across the 3-county area, like anybody can look at that and go, well, that's this percent of the total population. And so it's not very exciting. But if we get taxpayer consent, we can start talking about money. And so we can say that we've gotten almost $950,000 in refunds for folks, state and federal, that the earned income credit value was half of that we were able to get people $90,000 in homestead credits, and that allows them to pay their bills, pay down debt, take a family vacation, shop in their communities. There's a real economic benefit to what we do. We can't share those numbers unless we have taxpayer consent. So we have a consent form that we use. I'm going to keep one of these. And what we'll be doing is handing out this form when the taxpayer arrives at the intake table, so that the intake person has the opportunity to explain that to them a little bit. It's really a matter of helping our taxpayers understand that the information is always anonymous and aggregate. Again, those aren't words necessarily that all our taxpayers are going to understand. And so the best way that we can explain it to them is by actually pointing out on the form, we never use personal information like name, address, social security number, anything that would make it clear who a person is. But we do like to be able to say what kinds of credits they received and how much. We will have people, we always do, who look at this and go, I'm not giving you permission. Everybody's in my business already, and so there's no way I'm going to do that. We want to do our best to explain it, but we're not going to be forceful about it. And so part of the reason that you see more than, nearly, is because we know we exceeded those numbers. But we had taxpayers who wouldn't give us permission to include their refund in this grand total. And so I just want to be clear that, really that's what we're looking for, is just to be able, as we are keeping a running tally of the refunds that we achieve at our tax sites, we need their explicit authorization to include their refund amount in that running total. And I am welcome any ideas of how we can phrase that so that people feel comfortable. Because again, it's not about I'm going to highlight one person got a refund of $3,000 and another person got $4,212, where all of a sudden they go, well, that number is really specific. That someone might be able to figure that out. Well, no, because it's always part of the total. And so like I said, this is going to be distributed during the intake process, but similar to our intake and interview and our quality review, it takes everybody to make sure that the taxpayer understands. I also want to point out this is two-sided. It feels very redundant. This is not my choice. This is the IRS saying there is a section of law that requires you to get separate consent to use the data and to disclose the data. And so you can actually see that there are some differences in here where consent to use involves us creating a computer file where we store that anonymous data. Consent to disclose allows us to market the program and say $940,000 in refunds. Do we use those together? Yes, absolutely. But we are legally not allowed to condense that into a single consent. So it's really important that taxpayers know they need to address both sides. And it requires a signature either way. So we've got that they either grant consent or deny consent, but they have to choose one and they have to sign and date. And if it's married taxpayers, both parties have to sign. Now what we do is if somebody says, I give you consent to use my information but not disclose it, because for us they really go hand in hand, we treat that as an overall no. And so we won't include their information in our file. That's not something that you necessarily need to explain to the taxpayer, but just so that you understand how we're using it, which is that we're not, if we have that sort of yes-no scenario on one of those forms. Let's see here.
I think the simplest way to explain that to the people without getting too complicated is you just tell them, this is what we use to help the program to help you get a free tax return. And once you stress that point that it helps them get it free, they're usually more than willing to sign it.
And I have, this is an old handout, and I don't have enough copies for everyone, but you guys can take a look. But this is the kind of thing that we would use. So, for example, at the end of the season, we'll put out a press release that highlights what we were able to do in terms of number of people served and the amount of refunds. This is actually a presentation that I gave to Cap Services Board of Directors. But there again, it's got those dollar values on it. And so in order to include the full scope of what we do, we need permission to do that. But you know, I can have one of these at every site so that you can show, you know, like you can see there's not a single person's name on here. There's not even zip codes on here. I mean, it truly is just a total. And so if they can see an example, that sometimes helps too, that they can understand. We really are serious about we just want to brag. We just want to brag. You know, and it's tough because 2 years ago, we hit $1 million in refunds. And I'm sure we hit it last year too, but I can't tell people that because we had a number of people who wouldn't give us consent. And so to the public, it looks like our impact has actually dropped when it probably hasn't. And again, that's not the end of the world. I don't ever want a taxpayer to feel like it's their fault. They have that right to privacy. But I think if we do the right job of explaining how we use it and what it's for, that they should hopefully feel comfortable with that.